September 11th, 2001 is truly a day that will live in infamy. But on this program on terrorism, we're going to focus on three issues. Can we trust our own intelligence and law enforcement agencies? What are the reasons behind the Osama bin Laden activities? And finally, what should be America's response to this situation? Before I introduce the experts, let's get very clear on one thing. Virtually everyone in our government structure was informed on many occasions that terrorism was America's biggest external threat. In fact, a commission headed by former Senators Gary Hart and Warren Rudman made a report to Colin Powell, Donald Rumsfeld, and others in February of this year that indicated that terrorism was our primary national security threat. The commission's conclusion was, and I quote, that the United States is today very poorly organized to design and implement any comprehensive strategy to protect the homeland. Now, let me introduce you to some individuals. First by phone is Rick Stoll. He's Associate Dean of Social Sciences and Professor in Political Science at Rice University in Houston. He's written several books on world politics. Rick, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll be back with you shortly, but I want to introduce the people here in the studio. And sitting on my left is Mark Brisman. He is Director of the North Texas and Oklahoma Regional Office of the Anti-Defamation League. Mark, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
And sitting next to Mark is Ahmad Sabaty. He's Chairman of the Washington, D.C.-based Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, and he's the CEO of a real estate firm here in Dallas. Ahmad, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And next to him is Jim Hollifield. He's director of the John Tower Center for Political Studies at Southern Methodist University, and he'll be speaking this evening for the Dallas Council on World Affairs on this subject. Jim, welcome to the program. And finally, at the end is Oliver Buck Revelle. He heads his own consulting group on international security after having spent 30 years with the FBI. Buck, welcome to the program.
Thanks.
Buck, one of the things that we want to talk about that person needs to understand, and we've seen the news for 2 weeks now, and it's on constantly, but I don't think very many people finally understand what is causing this problem. Why are we having these kind of terrorist activities? And I know you've warned about it for a long time. In fact, I read your 19-page speech that you gave 6 years ago where you said this is the issue. Tell us what's behind this.
Well, this particular brand of terrorism really goes back to two significant events in 1979. One was the fall of the Shah of Iran and the takeover of Iran by the Ayatollahs, the creation of a very radicalized Islamic group holding that country. And then secondly, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. Now, in the situation with Iran, coming out of that, they took our own embassy staff hostage. They held them for virtually for 3.5 years. It showed the United States to be rather impotent in dealing with the issues. Out of that also grew groups like the Hezbollah, which carried out attacks in Lebanon, drove the United States out of Lebanon, and inflicted major casualties, again, without any response of significance on the part of the United States. On the other hand, in Afghanistan, we went in and supported the so-called freedom fighters at the time, the Mujahideen. We helped them recruit Islamic personnel from all over the Muslim world. We trained them and equipped them and helped them drive the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. And then we walked away and forgot them. Well, after the Gulf War in '91, remnants of that Mujahideen, particularly Osama bin Laden, believed that the United States and other Western powers should be totally out of Muslim countries, out of the Muslim territory, particularly out of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. And when we didn't, then we started seeing these attacks, and it goes all the way back to 1992 when we had the incident in Somalia. Then we had the World Trade Center. We had the planned attacks on July the 4th after the World Trade Center of Lincoln and Holland tunnels and so forth. Then we've had the bombings in Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, Khobar Towers, the USS Cole, East Africa, and so forth. It's been a campaign. This is not a revelation. This is not something that just happened. And each time there has been an escalation in the use of force. And as the report that you cited indicated, we should have seen this coming for a long time.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem that many of us are having is that we should have seen it coming. In fact, I have someone here, Phil, if you don't mind coming over here for a second. This is Phil Jordan. He's been on our program many times. And Phil, you were at one time head of the El Paso Intelligence Center. And I called you and I said, I'd be interested in your thinking on this. Have we, in effect, let the citizens down by not knowing this was happening and perhaps even stopping it from happening?
We absolutely let the citizens down. We let our country down by the fact that we knew, like Buck had stated, that this was coming, and we should have been not only ready but prepared, or prepared and ready. Again, I want to support everything that Buck has said here. One other thing that has made these radicals more potent, or think that they have all this macho power, is the fact that they were able to run the Russians out of Afghanistan. So if they can do that to Russia, they can probably do that to the United States in their way of thinking. I mean, not that they're going to, but we have to restructure our intelligence system, because all of this could have been prevented, as Buck and I were talking about prior to the meeting.
I appreciate that, Phil. I'm going to bring you back here in just a minute. Now, Buck, before I go to Jim Hollyfield, I want to ask you this one question, though, because there is an issue that viewer and many people who watch this program are concerned about, and that is the trade-off between what we have to do to really get prepared as a nation, CIA, FBI, additional powers, and the fact that we enjoy a significant amount of personal freedom in this country. Talk to me about that.
Well, with the CIA, we have to realize that in terrorism, we have to go back to human sources rather than technical means. That requires a change in the thinking of the intelligence community, that you have to get in with the people that are likely to attack you, and you can't do it by just technical means, which is unfortunately the way that it's been going. Within the United States, we have essentially said that the primary counterterrorism agency can only act after a crime is committed, because the Attorney General guidelines and the Privacy Act in combination require a criminal predicate. In other words, the specific creation of a crime or a crime conspiracy before the FBI can even open a case. Well, that's well and good if you're looking at a long-term conspiracy to defraud a bank, but it's very different if you're looking at 7,000 people being killed in one series of bombings or aircraft crashes. And we as a society have got to make up our mind, are we going to allow the collection of information in legal means, with constitutional means, or must we wait until a crime has been committed of this magnitude to start the process?
Yeah, that's a very, very tough question, and a question that is going to have to be asked and answered in the next few weeks and few months. Now, Jim, before I come to you, I'm going to mention something that we promised on this program. We were going to talk about some things that you hadn't heard before. You mentioned, Buck, a list of events, many of which were tied to Osama bin Laden. There's one event that I've asked you about and Phil Jordan about that you guys are not aware of, and I'm not saying that I am the expert, but let me say that I have done a significant amount of investigation in the Oklahoma City bombing, and every time I see on television they did this and this, then we had this terrorist Tim McVeigh of our own country who blew up Oklahoma City. I would say that Tim McVeigh was definitely guilty in Oklahoma City and got what he had coming, but my opinion is, based on the evidence that I have seen, is that Osama bin Laden funded the Oklahoma City situation, that Terry Nichols was very much involved with Osama bin Laden's connections in the Philippines, and that John Doe II was an Iraqi National Guard, that it was identified and I must say, Buck, interviewed, and a 302 was filled out on him by the FBI, and he's the one guy they've never cleared, but they've never done anything with. My evidence also says that he was working at Logan Airport for the last 3 or 4 years, Logan Airport in Boston. Now, I'm saying to you, I've tried to get this to the newspaper, every place I know, and to some law enforcement agencies, and everybody sort of seems to say, well, we don't know about that. I think there are 22 videotapes that the FBI has not released yet, and that hopefully by the time this program airs, you will see this in the major media, because if I'm right about this, and I could be wrong, if I'm right about this, what happened is that a guy that I know called 90 days ago and warned the Justice Department that if you don't pay attention to this evidence, they're going to blow up Lower Manhattan. That was 90 days before it happened. And if that's true, that is really a travesty of justice. And I'm through ranting about that right now. Jim, it's your turn. Amplify what Buck has said and give us some other ideas about why this happened.
Okay, well, I would like to give us more of a historical perspective on these events. I think that you have to go back and look at the rise of American power in the 20th century. If you go back to the 1920s and 30s, the United States, we had participated in World War I. We had withdrawn in the 20s and 30s into a kind of isolationist stance, isolationist foreign policy. And of course, that all changed really dramatically on December 7th, 1941. And we would, I think, have been tempted to withdraw again in terms of foreign policy after World War II. except for the fact that it was clear, I think, the lessons of the 20s and 30s, that we couldn't simply withdraw from the world, that we were going to have to win the peace as well as winning the war. In addition, of course, we suddenly found ourselves in a great struggle with the Soviet Union and with the communist world. Well, where I'm going with this is that the United States, at least since 1945, has been in an uncomfortable position. That is to say, we have been forced really into a leadership position, and I'm happy to say that we have assumed that leadership role. But I think it's, in some sense, what happened here is the price that you have to pay for leadership. If you just look at the Middle East, for example, or any region of the world, during the Cold War, we aligned ourselves with some regimes that perhaps were somewhat unsavory, but we felt that that was the price that we had to pay in order to defend the world against communism. This put us, to some extent, on the wrong side of a lot of people out there, especially in the Middle East. But if you look at the Middle East, clearly we are the only power, and have been for a long time, the only power that can go in and bring the parties together. If you want to get the Israelis to move, I mean, we're the only power that has the capability of moving the Israelis. And the fact that we have to be so far out in front on this has exposed us. I mean, so I think it's a price of leadership. In the 1990s, we won the Cold War. I think we became somewhat complacent. This goes back to what Buck was saying. We began to let our guard down. We began to relax. But we were still exposed as basically the leader in the world.
All right, so there are several reasons, and one of the ways it's been phrased in the media is, why do they hate us so much? And one of the things he talked about is that we were over there for the Gulf War, as an example. And some people say didn't finish the Gulf War with George Bush won. Some people would say that. We were over there. Osama bin Laden is a Saudi, as everybody knows this by now, I'm sure. 17th out of 52 kids or whatever, a very bright guy. 54 kids. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to, put down his dad. In any event, the problem is that he's a very smart guy, and he didn't like us being over there. He and a lot of people didn't like us being over there, as a matter of fact. In fact, a lot of Americans didn't like us being over there either, and staying after the war was over. Right. And then we had the situation in Afghanistan where we sort of helped the Mujahideen win the war, and then just sort of walked away, and into that void came the Taliban. That's an important thing. Right. Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about those two issues. You're talking about this in some ways. But the issue that seems to come up first, and it hadn't even come up first here, I'm going to talk to you two guys about. Let me start with you, Ahmad, because you have an interesting background. Tell us a bit about where you spent some of your early life, where you're from originally, first of all, and then give us some insight into the Palestinian-Israeli situation.
Well, I was born and raised in Beirut until I was 19 years old, and then I went to the West, to Germany and to this country for education, and I ended up in the United States. I actually went to SMU and got my PhD at SMU and ended up working here and getting married here and establishing my life in this country. I chose to become an American citizen and to make this country my homeland, mine and my children's homeland. I also worked in Kuwait for a development bank like the World Bank for 15 years. We were giving aid to needy countries. I was building power stations around the world. I was there during the Islamic Revolution when the Shah was deposed. I was there during the Iran-Iraq War. I was there during the Lebanese Civil War. I was there during many raids that we have had in South Lebanon from our neighbors to the south, the Israelis. I have lived the problems and hopes and despairs of that area and still do. I think, with all due respect to my two co-panelists, I think the problem is a bit deeper than what we have heard. We've heard from Buck what they did to us, which is true. They did all the list that he enunciated is true and is correct. But let's ask what we did to them, how we are perceived from that other side. And incidentally, I think it is sad that I see that the national debate is not going in this direction. The national debate from the president on down is repeating what Buck has said. they did this and this to us. They don't like our way of life. They don't like our freedom. They don't like our liberty. Therefore, they came and terrorized us. I don't think so. I beg to differ and I beg to disagree. Terrorism is an act of despair. Then we should stop and ask ourselves, why are these people desperate? And why are they taking out their despair on us? Do we have something to do with this or not? And my answer is yes.
All right. Well, you think we had something to do with that, and there are probably a lot of people who would agree with you, but most people might not, and it may be because they simply disagree with you, or maybe they don't know. So we're going to at least give that person a chance right now to know. So tell us what the problem is.
Well, the problem as it is perceived, people act on the perceived truth, not the real truth. Now, the list of gripes, whether they could be real or that we could imagine, nevertheless, they exist in their minds, and that's why they acted the way they acted. Again, I just want to hasten to say that explaining the etiology of this terrorism does not excuse it, by no means. I'm not defending anybody, nor do I speak for anybody. I'm just voicing a humble opinion of mine. These people think that we have sided with Israel since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Right or wrong, we have sided with Israel. A lot of miseries have been wreaked on the area, especially on the Palestinians, by the Israelis. The United States stayed oblivious to that, if not callous to that. The United States instigated Saddam Hussein to invade Iran in order to puncture the Islamic Revolution. For 8 years, we aided and helped. He was our boy, Saddam Hussein.
Well, let me stop you right there for a second, Ahmad, because I think our memory in this country is so short that a lot of people may not recall that. So take us back and give us just a bit more of when we were backing Saddam Hussein against Iran, and give us just a bit more of that
Well, the
landscape.
war actually started in this month, September of 1983. Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, and we encouraged him because we did not want the United States did not want the Islamic fervor of the Khomeini regime to spread into the Gulf and into the rest of the Muslim world. Also, Saddam Hussein was getting too big for his own britches. So what better to do than hit two birds with one stone? You weaken Iran and you weaken Saddam. So for 8 years, we helped Saddam until we went into the Iran-Contra affairs, and we started helping Iran. We switched side. And later on, we started supplying information to Iran and weapons to Iran, and information and weapons to Saddam. And the war lasted for 8 years with hundreds of thousands of people getting killed. Then we move on to the Gulf War. The Gulf War, by no means any sane person could justify the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. We went in, we had an international coalition, the whole world was behind us, to liberate Kuwait and unseat Saddam. What did we do? We liberated Kuwait, we left Saddam there. A sore to bleed the Iraqi people. We have decimated that country thanks to Saddam Hussein, but we kept him there.
Okay, that's a very interesting perspective, and I know you have more, and I'm going to come back to you. Mark, jump in there now. You've heard what he has to say. I saw a lot of nodding and agreement with a lot of things he was talking about.
There isn't much to disagree with in terms of the perception of many people in the community. But I think what's really important to point out is I think Osama bin Laden and other terrorist groups who claim to speak for Islam, in talking to many friends in the Muslim community of the last couple of weeks, they have said to me, so this is not just a feeling on my part, this is clearly people who are religiously observant and practicing Muslims in our community have said to me that what Osama bin Laden is talking about is a distortion of Islam, that Islam really is a religion of peace. So I think one of the things we have to keep in mind that it's not just Osama bin Laden in terms of reacting to supposedly what the United States has done to Muslims. It goes way beyond there. There's clearly a political agenda there. There's clearly an ideology there that really goes way beyond any specific conflict. In terms of they do not view the king in Jordan as legitimate. They'd want to overturn Jordan. Clearly, they would like to destroy Israel. They would want to overturn Mubarak in Egypt. They have said this. I mean, this is nothing that I'm making up.
Yeah,
this is in their documents.
Let me say that Ahmad is nodding his head and agree with you.
Absolutely.
So go right ahead.
Absolutely.
Their agenda is not.
Right. And I think we make a real mistake. I really do. I think we make a real mistake by focusing in on any one particular issue. We as a country, I believe, need to come together and be united and understand that, number one, they do not represent true Islam. And we need to understand that, and particularly its implications in terms of Muslims Americans and Arab Americans. Number two, for us to ultimately defeat these people, we have to really be united in that effort. And number three, ultimately, some of the absolute poverty that attracts people to this kind of movement, that is the incubator to this kind of movement, we as a nation and the West as a community need to focus in on that poverty and remove a lot of the reasons why these people feel hopeless and things of that nature.
Well, I think that's a good point, because I think envy is a big part of the issue, as well as this clash of cultures. Ahmad, please.
I fully subscribe to what Mark is saying. I think this terrorism is a cry of despair. People despair there of ever getting a better life, whether it be in the political arena, the economic arena, you name it. And we, in this country can help a lot. And to begin with, we can stop siding with the dictators and the demagogues that run the countries over there.
And that's been one of the issues I
Yes.
think that person doesn't understand as well, is that we sit here and we profess to be in favor of freedom and democratic governments, and yet because of our own political and or economic interests,
Absolutely.
we have made some strange bedfellows.
Absolutely. Not only that, but the average American genuinely believes in peace, and he believes in democracy and freedom as much as he believes in God. And he wants to do good, not just for this country, but in the world. Mm-hmm. Then lo and behold, something like that happens, and he's shocked, understandably so. But he's not aware of what our government is doing overseas.
Exactly. Jim?
I think we should be careful here and not disillusion ourselves into thinking that the people who carried out this attack are the most desperate, impoverished people in the world. I mean, these were quite sophisticated, well-educated, middle class. Osama bin Laden himself is an upper middle class, very wealthy Saudi, even though he comes from a large family. So I'm not convinced of this, what I would simply call immiseration thesis, you know, that there's a lot of misery out there. I think as a political scientist, I think we have to look at when regimes and societies are in change or in the process of change. That's when they're the most dangerous, and when you can have groups like this.
You know,
come
some of these people can appeal to these folks. Now, Buck, I know has to leave very shortly, so Rick, I'm going to come to you. I haven't forgotten about you, and Steve, I want to get you in just a minute. But because Buck has to leave in just a minute, Buck, let me just switch gears at the moment and say, okay, we've heard these things in terms of causes. Give us 2 or 3 of the things that you think we should do and or should not do in response to the situation.
Well, first, we should not give up the Bill of Rights. Absolutely. We have to live, we cannot allow the terrorists to change our system of government and the protections of the individual in our society. But we have to be smarter. We can't make rules that make no sense and then change them after the fact. We can't say we're going to be deaf, dumb, and blind and not pay attention to what's happening in our own society. We can't allow hate to be spread over the internet and through other means and then take no cognizance of it until we have these kind of events. And unfortunately, that's what's happening. So we have to be realistic about the ability for our law enforcement agencies to pay attention to the growing hatred that is there amongst the various groups and their plans and intentions. Osama bin Laden has been telling us exactly what he was going to do for about the past 7 years. Now, also, we have got to make sure that our international intelligence capability is substantially increased. We shouldn't be sitting back and waiting on these events. We must be prepared to interdict them. Now, we have many events have been interdicted and prevented, or we would have had this many times over. But it's not sufficient when you have something like happened on September the 3rd.
I think that's right. And I'm not sure that the average person knows how many things have been interdicted. And your times with the FBI and what you know in your consulting, because you consult all over the world with companies who are interested in these issues, right?
That's right.
And so you're there for one reason, not to clean up something afterwards, but to prevent it from happening, correct?
To try and protect their people to see that they're not victimized.
Now, do you think we can do that? Do you think that our leaders, first of all, understand that issue, and secondly, that we have the capability of putting something like that in place fairly soon, and soon enough to hopefully prevent something as tragic as what happened a couple of weeks
Well, I've been
ago.
very pleased that we didn't engage in a knee-jerk reaction, that we didn't send a missile into the Sudan, that we have now taken a more, shall we say, analytical approach in trying to actually figure out the nodes involved, that we have to act to prevent and to protect ourselves. And we've given those who are harboring a chance to redeem themselves. Do I think that military action will have to come? Apparently so. I would prefer to see law enforcement action. I prefer to see them arrested and prosecuted. I think that's the way we need to go. But we may not have that choice. But whatever it is, we have to make sure they understand they cannot carry out these attacks against the United States.
Buck, I really appreciate your working us into your schedule. Keep your seat right there just for a second till I go to Rick, and then Rick, you've heard what's been said here. Give us your thinking about causes, and then go on into what you think we ought to do.
A photo of Rick is shown.
Rick, are you with me?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, go right ahead.
I think that the group is absolutely correct. There have been things that have laid the basis for this that go back a number of years and weave together several different issues, several different locations. So if we were to talk about, well, what could we now do to undo some of that, that's not something that's going to be simple or easy to do. And second of all, I would make the general observation that, at least as I look at American foreign policy, it's not done to any one coherent plan, even though it may appear to be that way to the outside. So I do think these are things that have been building up, and it's going to be very difficult for us to do something or a series of things to reduce the number of people that look at the United States and assume we're going to do something bad, or assume that we're so powerful that we ought to be able to make things right, when from our point of view that's not possible. I think we do want to improve our intelligence capability, and whether that and that should involve, relying more on human intelligence, perhaps reorganizing things. But on the other hand, I think we ought to be realistic about how much we can expect this to help. Penetrating some of these groups, I'm not an expert in this, probably some of your other guests are, is not a simple thing to do. And furthermore, I think intelligence failures are part of the nature of the game, because I think what fundamentally happens is you get a piece of information, and you have to figure out what does it mean, and that in turn is a process by which you have some vision of what's going on, and you fit this information into that vision. And it can fall together in a very nice pattern where everything seems to fit, but you were looking in the wrong place. I think we can do things to minimize that, but I don't think we ought to feel that there's any organizational scheme or smarter people or some kind of fix such that this could never happen again.
All right. And then what you're saying is that, gosh, who would have thought, who would even have conceived of someone running 2 airplanes into the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon? So if you get information and you don't have it in your mind that this might happen, I would assume that now if you get some information that leads you to that conclusion, it would be fairly easy to see the writing on the wall, right?
Right. And for example, this latest reports that we heard yesterday about crop dusters, whatever the reality is behind that, but sort of hearing things, seeing things that suggest that some of these same people were interested in crop dusting, I think the conclusion that they may have been interested in using these to disperse chemical or biological weapons, in that logic made sense, and you could do something about that. I would suspect that the next major terrorist event against the United States will be done in a way that's dramatically different than what we've just seen. And we have to be creative about figuring out what might happen next, but I think it's inevitable that occasionally we are going to fail because we're just not going to be looking in the right direction.
Yeah, I'm afraid you're right about that. Here's a couple of comments from the audience. Go ahead.
Dennis, these Islamic terrorists don't need therapy, and they also don't need development aid. These were not acts of, quote, desperation because I haven't seen my psychiatrist, and they weren't acts of poverty because I haven't had enough foreign aid from the United States. These are acts of war. These are wars that have been going on for not just decades, but centuries. There's a description that Islam is a religion of peace, yet when it came out of the Arabian Peninsula, it was on the steeds of war. And every country that Islam currently occupies, it occupied through conquest. And this claim that it is simply part of peace, I don't see from history. And I think this is simply the latest round in a war that's been going on for centuries. And until we recognize that, we're fooling ourselves.
because it's stereotyping and blaming an entire religion, which is a rich faith and a rich history. And I think if you look at Islam and you read the Quran, and I've had the honor to read the Quran over the years, this is a warped interpretation of what Islam preaches. And I think if you look throughout history, those people who've claimed to be speaking in the name of Allah and getting their righteousness, if you will, from the Quran, it's a warped distortion. And I think what we have to do is really ensure in those areas where this radicalism, this misinterpretation of Islam can be used, primarily because the populations are desperate. We're not talking Osama bin Laden and his $300 million. The vast majority of people they recruit into Hamas or Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda don't have $300 million. They come out of that poverty background, some of them. Some of them come from middle-class homes. And so what we have to do long-term is get rid of the dictatorships and promote democracy in that part of the world, because a democratic government elected by the people is going to be concerned about the people and be more responsive to the people. And I don't think it's accurate or helpful to blame an entire faith because of the misinterpretation and misuse of that faith.
Jim?
Yes, I just want to pick up on one thing that the questioner said here, and referring to this as an act of war. Clearly we're in a kind of uncharted territory here. And go back to the terrorists themselves. As you heard earlier, I'm a bit skeptical of this notion that they are driven strictly by ideology or that they're driven strictly by religion. These are people who are on a power trip, who are hell-bent on destroying something in order to attract attention to themselves and presumably to a cause. But I really think there is a power element involved here. And for the first time, really in history, it's hard to find similar examples where individuals or groups of individuals have been able to accomplish such a dramatic attack on a nation state, much less the most powerful nation state in the world. So we're, from a standpoint of international relations, international law, we're in kind of uncharted territory here. You could hear it earlier with Mr. Revelle, who was calling for a law enforcement response and intelligence response to this. We're now engaged in what looks like a military response, which is what one would expect in a state of war. But you know, we're not into a clash of civilizations here. I think we ought to avoid the clash notion, which was popularized by my colleague Sam Huntington at Harvard. I would really stay away from that logic.
Thanks, Ahmad.
I can understand your anger. I'm angry myself, but let's not let anger warp our views. Obviously, you have not read the Quran or read much about Islam, or I don't know what version of Islam you read. Islam is not a monolith. It spans the entire spectrum from the extreme right to the extreme left. Believe it or not, there were so-called Muslim communists. I don't know how they could reconcile the two, but there were Muslim communists. And then for us to come here in a show with Dennis McCuistion and paint an entire religion and an entire 1.3 billion people as hawkish and warlike and warmongers is, I would say, a bit unfair.
Okay, let me go to this question then. Dan?
Dennis, I think we need to add some clarity to the situation. In World War II, when we went to war with Germany, Nazism, we didn't ask what was the problem. Was Hitler justifiably upset because of the Versailles Peace Treaty? No, we went and defeated Nazi Germany. We didn't ask about the Japanese. Did they have a legitimate gripe for attacking Pearl Harbor because we supposedly wouldn't sell them oil? We went and defeated them. These people, these terrorist groups, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, they hate the United States and they hate Israel for what we are. And let's not forget, these groups are all the ones, or the ones who say the problem with Adolf Hitler is he didn't kill enough Jews.
Okay, thank you very much for that comment. Yes, sir?
Yes, I would like to add to what my previous colleagues here in the audience said, and I completely disagree with what Mr. Sabati had said about the fact that these are people in despair. I think Mr. Sabati is a prominent leader probably in the community, in the Muslim community in Dallas, and I think, Dennis, that he needs to come out and speak out against those things, and not only after what happened in New York. He had the opportunity to do so the whole year round with a lot of terror attacks going on from Hezbollah, from Islamic Jihad and Hamas, blowing up individual civilians, children, women at any opportunity, and he did not speak up. And I think this is part of our problem. The mainstream, modern, moderate Islamic people in this world are being silent when this happens. They only come out now when it hits New York, when it's close to home, and they feel the heat. I think they did not do their job as leaders. They've not been proactive. They've been silent. And I think that's part of the reason that we allow this whole thing to get to where it is today.
Okay. I'm obviously I'm going to give you a chance to respond to that, but
Well,
I
I'm
also
gonna
have someone else here
very
who
quickly.
may want to do that
Mark
too.
and I had spoken about this, and we agree on what was said and what was not said.
Okay.
I'm not going to respond to that.
All right, great. You want to come up here and have something to say about this, please?
I think I agree with what Mark has so eloquently explained, the Islamic faith, and painting the whole Islamic faith, or 1.2 billion people, with one brush of prejudice and bigotry is not going to serve the purpose of this cause we are over here. We are all here American, and happen to be some of us are Muslim. We have to condemn wherever, whenever this act of terrorism occur, and we did that. And I think it's about time, and I agree with another gentleman who said that we have to be proactive, and I think that is going to help us a lot.
Okay. Thank you very much for the comment. Now, Jim, and then I'm going to go to the last guy who we haven't introduced yet, so go ahead.
Okay, well, I just want to respond very quickly to something that was said by one of the members of the audience. I think that we, in the West, and not only in the West, but throughout the world, to some extent, we've been a victim of our own successes here. I mean, we have constructed a more liberal, a more open, and more tolerant world probably than any time in history. There is a lot of freedom. So I do think that as much as it sounds like a truism or a cliche, that this was an attack on open, liberal, and free societies. I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. And echoing what has already been said here, a cornerstone of those societies is tolerance, a respect for certain constitutional principles. So I think we have to see this as an attack on those principles.
All right, I thank you for that. And I don't know, we have not brought in Steve Moore yet because Steve was busy. Steve, are you there with me?
I'm here, Dennis.
All right, good. Hang in there for a second. Let me introduce you to the people watching. Steve Moore is president of the Washington, D.C.-based Club for Growth, and he's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and Steve is actually in Phoenix today, or Tucson, I forget which, doing some speaking. And Steve, you had an interesting and provocative article in the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal last week. You're an economist by trade, so give us just a couple of 3 minutes of the impact of this on the economy and what you were arguing for in that particular article.
Well, Dennis, I was making the point that this was not just an attack against our military and our political system, but also a direct assault against our free market system of capitalism. And we need to recognize it as such. And unfortunately, it was a very effective attack. As everyone knows, the stock market, the Dow Jones, was down 1,400 points last week, although it's recovered a bit. The fact is that if you look at these statistics, Americans have lost a lot of wealth. The economy looks like it's in some tough trouble right now, Dennis. And my point was that one of the ways we should fight this terrorist incident is try to rebuild our economy as quickly as possible. And so I was arguing for more dramatic tax reductions. I think, Dennis, we ought to cut the capital gains tax in half, which would put value back into the stocks that many millions of patriotic Americans were buying American stocks in the aftermath of the World Trade Center buying because they wanted to invest in America. And if we cut the capital gains tax, they might be able to make some profits, or at least reduce the losses that people have taken. We should probably, Dennis, also look at fast-forwarding a lot of the tax cuts that were in the Bush tax bill. The original idea was to phase these in 2005 and 2006 and thereafter. And the point is, we really need these tax cuts now because I think we're teetering right on the verge of what could be a pretty deep recession.
Well, Steve, those are good points. And let me just make the typical counterpoints that people would say to somebody like you. They would say, look, Steve, the deficit that we had before is now a surplus. You're going to give up all the surplus. You go cutting taxes. Every time you cut the capital gains tax, I'm sure that the tax revenue goes down, doesn't it, or does it?
Well, first of all, Dennis, it's really critical for people to understand that if we do have a deep recession, then we are going to see big deficits, because that always happens every time we have a downturn. And the economy really does drive these budget numbers, Dennis. And my point is, unless we get this economy moving again, which we have to do, well, there aren't going to be any more surpluses. And so if you look at the evidence, for example, Dennis, on this capital gains tax issue, the truth is every time we have cut the capital gains tax in the last 30 years, we have actually gotten more revenues, not less revenues, because people then voluntarily take the gains that they've made. They pay more revenues. In fact, we doubled the tax revenues the last time we cut the capital gains tax. Now, the primary purpose of this, Dennis, is not to raise revenue, but to put some juice in this economy right now when it really desperately needs it.
Well, I think you're right about that, Steve, and I really appreciate your taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. So let me make that point that Steve made one more time, and it really is true. You can like it or not like it, but the facts are clear. If you cut capital gains taxes, the amount of revenue that you collect from the capital gains tax goes up because people sell their stocks and they pay more taxes, but they also keep more of it, which is sort of the American way of doing things last time I checked. Now, I have a gentleman here who's been very patient. Go ahead.
It seems to me that we have two things going here, Dennis. One is a rebuilding of the Maggio line as we talk about economics and as we talk about war. I have many close friends in the Islamic world, and they would say to us, the main thing wrong with Christians and Americans is that you're not Christian enough. And we haven't talked about Christianity in this conversation at all, but we have not been our brother's keeper around the world. We have not led with the kind of intellectual and moral leadership that we could have done, and this is part of the despair. We have allowed things to fester. We have allowed swamps to build. We have ignored what might have been a better world. We, in fact, have to have a nobler cause than we have had.
I appreciate that. So it's not just military and action that's anti-terrorist. There are other things that we should do as a country.
This terrorism is the consequence. It's not the cause.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Jim, please.
If I could just quickly respond both to Mr. Moore, who spoke in the Cato Institute, and the last member of the audience. I think we have to be very, very careful here not to lose sight of what we're up against. As much as one could argue for cutting taxes and capital gains taxes, and as much as one could argue for building the moral and spiritual strength of the country, I think we're not going to take issue with that. We might argue about tax cuts, but we have to realize that we are in a, not quite a life and death struggle here, but we have to stay very, very focused on the task at hand, which is finding these people, I keep hearing the term, rooting them out, getting them literally before they get us. And if we get sidetracked into focusing on capital gains cuts or something else, I think we lose focus as a nation, and we have to stay very, very focused in this situation.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thanks, Phil.
Dennis, I just want to bring one other point. With all due respect to the FBI and to Buck Revell, my personal friend, and to a couple of your panelists, law enforcement alone is not going to solve this problem. It's going to have to take a military action with support from law enforcement. This was an act of war, as the president stated very clearly, and anybody that has done this to America has to be held accountable. So law enforcement in the United States has failed the American people in preventing this disaster, and a cowardly act by these militants, and therefore we have to respond accordingly. You cannot respond by putting one of these guys in jail and then negotiating whether they should be sentenced to death or not. It should be search and destroy. End of my comment.
Thank you. Mark, go ahead.
I don't see the FBI hostage rescue team going into the caves of Afghanistan. Clearly, it's a military reaction. But I think, Buck is not here any longer. And clearly, that's been his perspective for 30 years. But I think we're in a different category now. And this was an act of war against the United States and everything we stand for. And therefore, the response has to be military. But I think one of the things that I'm perceiving in the early days is the president, who I think is to be absolutely commended for his leadership of the country right now. They're taking their time. They're realizing it's a multi-pronged attack. And you had mentioned earlier about, we're impatient as a country and we forget things just a couple of weeks ago. And I think one of the things the president's doing, and I think we all need to keep saying it over and over again, we're in this for the long haul. Right. This is not weeks, this is not months, this is really years. And some of our best and finest are not going to come back from this, and they're going to give their lives for this country. But this is clearly a military response. Law enforcement probably has a role in this, but it's a whole new ball game, and I would call it really World War III.
Well, let me mention again, in trying to tell you some things that you haven't heard in other places, let me share something that I found the other day that I found fascinating. This came from the Center for Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at St. Andrews University in St. Andrews, Scotland. I think there is something there other than a golf course, last I checked. And here's what they said about this. They said there have typically been 4 factors over the years that have prevented most suicide attacks, like the ones we've had in the last couple of weeks and ones we've had before. Here are those 4 factors. One is that the terrorists have been reluctant to kill lots of people. Second, they have had in the past a desire to claim responsibility. If something happened, they want to say, hey, that was our deal. Third, they have had an unwillingness to use suicide weapons. And fourth, technical difficulty. That is, how could they pull this off? Now, what they went on to say was the first 3 are gone. The first 3 in this bombing of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon are gone. They're off the table. And if you believe that number 4, technical difficulty is not gone, I think we're kidding ourselves there too. They proved they could do it. So all of those things are off the table now from what they were before. Now this, I found this after the bombing because I'm always behind on my newspapers, but this is Parade Magazine, not exactly a scholarly journal to say the least. But September 9th, 2 days before the bombing, this matchbook cover has Osama bin Laden. Apparently there are 22 million tobacco users in Pakistan, and his picture has been on the back of matchbooks with his photo saying in Arabic, Osama bin Laden up to $500,000 reward. Actually, it's a printing error. It should say 5 million. But the FBI has been distributing those matchbooks in Pakistan for the last year and a half. So that's kind of interesting, too. Did anybody know about that? I didn't hear about that.
Yes, that's part of their effort. He's on the FBI's 10 most wanted list.
10 most wanted list.
But, Dennis, I think there's a key point to make. We seem to be blaming law enforcement for a lot of stuff. The question is, how did they get on those airplanes? And the real issue and the real problem here is security on our airplanes and in our airports up until now have been a joke. If you take a look at what El Al does in terms of security, while there's no guarantee, it certainly doesn't have these problems. So I think we need to really start in the way we're going to rebuild our airlines and trust in our airlines again is we have to get genuinely serious about real security in terms of what goes into our airports and what gets on our planes.
Okay. Rick, let me ask you in terms of what have we not mentioned? We just have a few minutes left about what we ought to do for the future or ought not to do.
I think while calling this a war sends a message to the American people that this is a long, difficult struggle. There will be lives lost. We will pay potentially a heavy price. All of that, I think, is what the president and the administration wants to send. But on the other hand, I really can't see this ending in any way that resembles the way wars typically end, with somebody surrendering, with an agreement signed. So while there is certainly a role for military action, I think you're going to find that if these people just want to disappear, they can do that. Now, there's good to that because they're not doing terrorist acts while they're off on their own and hiding out. But I think to actually go after them, quote unquote, whether you want to put them on trial or not is a separate issue. But you're going to have to do a lot of things that more closely resemble, say, how law enforcement officials attack organized crime than a military operation to seize a piece of territory or to blow a whole bunch of things up. So if you want to call it a war, please understand it's not going to end the way a war ends. An awful lot of other elements are going to be involved.
Thank you very much. Here's a comment from the audience.
Yes, thank you. I have a couple questions. First of all, how can terrorism be described as an act of despair when the bombers, the terrorists who took us, lived as free people for up to a year and a half? Seems that there wasn't any despair on their part. And the second question is, why is only this act of terrorism to be condemned? Algeria, Egypt, the Sudan. Didn't hear anything about, or Israel, any condemnation of terrorism anywhere else in the world.
Okay, Jim first, then Ahmad.
Yes, well, I think George W. Bush alluded to this in his speech when he said that we are going after terrorism which has a global reach. So we're not going to attack every terrorist and every terrorist group in every corner of the world. We're not going into Northern Ireland, for example, or into the Basque region of Spain. We are literally looking at those groups that are coming to destroy us and that are threatening the American people and the American way of life. And I just want to go back just briefly to this business of an act of war. I mean, I do think my colleague is absolutely right that we're using this because Americans like the black and white thing. You're with us or you're against us. This is clearly an act of war. But unfortunately, we are dealing with something that is in the gray area here. And that doesn't help to mobilize people. But just think a minute about this notion of an act of war. Are we going to treat the terrorists as prisoners of war if we capture them under the Geneva Convention? Think about that for a minute, because war is waged according to certain principles.
Ahmad.
I don't think despair dissipates overnight, whether these people lived for a year and a half or 2 years. Despair is more of a state of mind than a state of well-being or welfare. And when I talked about despair, I was not referring to how much money one has in the bank as much as one being disillusioned with the whole setup in their own countries, that we aspire for certain things, and this big power, the United States, again, whether rightly or wrongly, is not enabling us to do this or that. And this is where the despair is being born.
The term is really relative deprivation.
Exactly.
I mean, these are people who have some deep-seated angers and frustrations and feel relatively deprived. So this deprivation is deep enough for them to act, but we've got to ask ourselves, what do they want? Right. They got our attention now.
Well,
what do they want?
They definitely have our attention. There's no doubt about that. Now, we just have a couple minutes left. Ahmad, very quickly.
I would like to follow up on the bombing and the war. And I think we have to be very careful here, is because there's a camp emerging in this country now that we want to go out there and settle scores. This is not time to settle scores. Is it revenge we want or justice? If we want revenge, then we are no better than the terrorists, because you exact revenge, they come back for another round, and so on and so forth, and this is endless. We have to be very, very careful. The anger in the country is understandable. I understand it. I share it. But we cannot allow ourselves to act on our raw emotions. That's number one. Number two, getting Osama bin Laden or whoever is behind it is necessary, but not sufficient. Right. We need to convene an international body on terrorism to define what terrorism is, what constitutes an act of terrorism, and so on. Get the best international legal minds in the world to draw a convention, just like we have the Geneva Convention on Warfare, and we have the convention now on the World Trade Organization. Yeah. Let's have a convention on terrorism, have all the countries in the world be signatory to that, and then any country that harbors these can be ostracized by the whole world, and not just the United States.
I think that's an interesting thought. On the other hand, some of those countries are probably not going to sign that, and they may be the ones who
then they can be ostracized.
Right. Let me just close. First of all, Steve, I appreciate your coming in and giving us that economic perspective, and Rick, thank you for joining us from Houston. And one of the issues that, you know, this whole thing with Israel and the Palestinians is obviously a continuing issue. And do you consider Hamas or Hezbollah a terrorist organization too? I mean, that's a whole nother program we could do, as all of you know. At least one. I really appreciate all three of you being here, and Buck for coming around for as long as he could. However, let's be very clear on something. We've had a series of wake-up calls. Finally, we as a nation may pay attention to what's important instead of trying to entertain ourselves to death through sports and junk television. Perhaps now each of us will become more involved in the political process and get up to speed on the important issues of the day. That's the #1 reason why we're here every week for the last 10 years. Thanks for watching as we talk about things that really matter with people who really care.